The frozen river's deafening crack shattered the winter silence as Grace Ellis felt the ice give way beneath her feet, plunging her and her infant daughter into the merciless, icy waters of the Powder River. It was January 1878 in Wyoming Territory, and what had begun as a desperate journey across the frozen landscape to reach the nearest settlement had turned into a mother's worst nightmare. Grace gasped as the freezing water stole her breath away, clutching her 6-month-old baby, Lily, tightly to her chest. The heavy winter clothing that had protected them from the bitter cold now dragged her down like an anchor, pulling her beneath the surface. With every ounce of strength she possessed, Grace pushed Lily upward, trying to keep her daughter's tiny face above the water. "Help!" she screamed, her voice thin against the howling winter wind. "Please, somebody help us." Ethan Zimmerman heard the cries while tracking a wounded elk along the river's edge. The 30-year-old cowboy abandoned his hunt without hesitation, spurring his horse toward the sound of distress. As he crested the small hill overlooking the river, he saw the terrifying scene unfold before him, a woman struggling in the broken ice, clutching something small and precious to her chest. "Hold on," Ethan shouted, dismounting from his horse in one fluid motion. He grabbed his lasso from the saddle and ran toward the river, his boots crunching through the snow. His mind raced as he assessed the situation. The ice near the edges seemed solid enough, but he would need to distribute his weight carefully to avoid joining the woman in the frigid water. Grace was losing her battle with the current. Her fingers were growing numb, and Lily's cries were weakening as the cold seeped into her tiny body. When Grace caught sight of the broad-shouldered cowboy running toward them, hope flickered in her heart. "My baby," she called out, her teeth chattering violently. "Please save my baby first." Ethan dropped to his stomach, spreading his weight across the ice as he inched toward the broken section. His heart pounded against his ribs as he extended the rope. "I'm going to get you both out," he promised, his voice steady despite the fear gripping him. "Can you put the loop around your baby?" With trembling hands, Grace managed to secure the loop around Lily's bundled form. "She's ready," she gasped, her lips turning blue. "I'm pulling her in now. Hold on just a little longer," Ethan called, gradually drawing the rope back, bringing the whimpering infant across the ice toward him. He worked methodically, understanding that any sudden movements could send the ice cracking further. When Lily reached him, Ethan carefully lifted the soaked bundle, shocked by how cold the baby felt even through her wrappings. He quickly placed her in his sheepskin coat, trying to share his body heat with the infant as he prepared to rescue her mother. "I'm coming back for you," he called to Grace, who was visibly weakening, her movements becoming sluggish in the freezing water. Ethan hurried back to his horse, placing the baby in a secure position before returning to the edge with his rope. Grace's head had slipped beneath the water once, then twice. Time was running out. "Grab the rope," Ethan shouted, throwing the loop toward her. It took 3 attempts before Grace's numbed fingers closed around it. "That's it. Now put it around yourself." With the last of her strength, Grace secured the loop around her chest. Ethan braced himself against a nearby tree and pulled, straining against her waterlogged weight. Inch by painful inch, he dragged her from the water's grip onto the solid ice. When she was close enough, he grabbed her arms and pulled her completely clear of the hole. Grace collapsed onto the snow, barely conscious. Without wasting a moment, Ethan lifted her into his arms and carried her to his horse. The baby was whimpering weakly inside his coat, a sound that both worried and relieved him. At least she was still alive. "My cabin's not far," he told Grace, though he wasn't sure she could hear him. "I'm going to get you both warm." Mounting his horse with both mother and child was a challenge, but Ethan managed it, placing Grace in front of him where he could support her with one arm while controlling the horse with the other. The baby remained nestled against his chest, protected from the biting wind. The ride to his cabin seemed endless as Ethan felt Grace's body growing colder against his. The baby's cries had subsided to occasional whimpers, which worried him even more. When his small log cabin finally came into view, Ethan breathed a prayer of thanks. He dismounted carefully, carrying Grace inside first and laying her on his bed. Then he retrieved the baby from inside his coat. Little Lily's face was pale, her lips tinged with blue. "Stay with me, little one," he murmured, placing her beside her mother before rushing to build up the fire. The cabin quickly filled with warmth as the flames grew higher. Ethan worked methodically, removing Grace's frozen outer garments first, then wrapping her in every blanket he owned. He did the same for Lily, rubbing her tiny limbs gently to encourage circulation. For hours, Ethan moved between mother and child, monitoring their breathing, warming water to place hot compresses on their extremities, and occasionally spooning small amounts of warm broth between Grace's lips when she stirred. It was well past midnight when Grace finally opened her eyes fully, panic immediately flooding her features. "Lily, where's my baby?" She tried to sit up, her voice hoarse. "She's right here," Ethan soothed, lifting the infant from the small nest of blankets he'd created near the fire. "She's doing better than you are, I think." Relief washed over Grace's face as she reached for her daughter. Lily was awake. Her color improved, though she still felt cooler than normal to the touch. "You saved us," Grace whispered, tears forming in her eyes as she looked up at the tall cowboy. "We would have died without you. Anyone would have done the same," Ethan replied, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Can I ask what you were doing crossing that river with a baby?" "The nearest town is 30 miles in either direction." Grace's expression darkened. "My husband died 3 months ago. Fever took him. The bank took our farm 2 days ago." Her voice broke. "I was trying to reach my cousin in Pine Ridge. She doesn't know I'm coming, but she's all the family I have left." Ethan nodded, understanding the desperation that would drive a young mother to attempt such a dangerous journey. "You're welcome to stay here until you're both strong enough to travel. And when that time comes, I'll take you to Pine Ridge myself." "Thank you, Mr. Zimmerman." "Ethan Zimmerman," he supplied, pouring her a cup of coffee. "And you are?" "Grace Ellis. And this is Lily." She stroked her daughter's cheek softly. "I can't thank you enough, Mr. Zimmerman." "Ethan, please," he insisted, placing the coffee in her hands. "Drink this. It'll help warm you from the inside." As Grace sipped the coffee gratefully, Ethan busied himself preparing a simple meal. His cabin was modest, one room with a small lean-to for his horse, but it was sturdy and warm. He'd built it himself 3 years earlier after leaving his position as foreman on the Rocking T Ranch, preferring solitude to the complications of working for others. "I hope you don't mind beans and salt pork," Ethan said, placing a plate beside her. "It's not fancy, but it's hot." "It's perfect," Grace assured him, shifting Lily to one arm so she could eat. The baby began to fuss, clearly hungry herself. "She probably needs feeding," Grace murmured, looking uncomfortable. Understanding her need for privacy, Ethan nodded. "I'll go check on my horse. Take your time." Outside, Ethan leaned against the stable wall, breathing in the cold air. Something about the young woman and her baby had stirred feelings he'd thought long buried, protective instincts, certainly, but something else too. Something he wasn't ready to acknowledge. When he returned to the cabin, Grace had finished feeding Lily and was looking more alert, though exhaustion still lined her face. "You should rest," Ethan advised. "Both of you have been through an ordeal. Where will you sleep?" Grace asked, noticing there was only one bed in the small cabin. "Don't worry about me. I've slept in worse places than my own floor," he assured her with a small smile. As darkness settled outside, Grace drifted into sleep with Lily secured beside her. Ethan made himself as comfortable as possible on a bedroll near the fire, but sleep eluded him. His thoughts kept returning to the moment he'd pulled them from the river, how close they had come to being lost forever. Something about that thought made his chest tighten uncomfortably. The next few days established a simple routine. Grace gained strength rapidly, though she developed a persistent cough that worried Ethan. Lily, resilient as only the very young can be, seemed to bounce back completely, rewarding Ethan with gummy smiles that he found himself working to earn. On the 4th morning, Ethan woke to find Grace already up, attempting to cook breakfast at his small stove. She had Lily secured to her chest with a length of cloth. "You don't need to do that," he protested, quickly rising. "I want to," Grace replied firmly. "You've done so much for us. It's the least I can do." Ethan noticed she swayed slightly as she spoke, and when he moved closer, he could see the flush on her cheeks that didn't belong there. "You're sick," he stated, gently taking the spoon from her hand. "You need to rest." "I'm fine," she insisted, but her body betrayed her as a coughing fit doubled her over. Ethan steadied her with a hand on her arm. Back to bed, he ordered gently, helping her across the room. Let me take Lily. Grace reluctantly allowed him to unwrap the baby from her chest. To his surprise, Lily came to him willingly, her small hands reaching for his beard with fascination. She likes you, Grace observed, her voice rough from coughing. She wasn't even that comfortable with her father. Ethan didn't know how to respond to that, so he focused on settling Grace back into bed and placing a cool cloth on her forehead. Her skin burned beneath his fingers. You've got a fever, he told her. Probably from being in that water. I have some willow bark tea that might help. As he prepared the tea, Ethan kept Lily entertained, speaking to her in the soft voice he usually reserved for skittish horses. The baby watched him with serious eyes, occasionally breaking into delighted giggles when he made funny faces at her. Grace's condition worsened over the next 2 days. Her cough deepened, and her fever rose despite Ethan's best efforts with willow bark tea and cool compresses. She drifted in and out of consciousness, leaving Ethan to care for Lily alone. He discovered reserves of patience he hadn't known he possessed as he figured out how to change the baby's cloth diapers and prepare the thin gruel that supplemented what little milk Grace could provide during her brief lucid periods. On the third night of Grace's illness, as a blizzard howled outside the cabin, Ethan sat beside her bed, watching her labored breathing with growing fear. Lily slept in a makeshift cradle he'd fashioned from a drawer, lined with his softest shirts. Ethan, Grace whispered, her eyes fluttering open. If I don't make it, don't talk like that, he interrupted firmly. You're going to be fine. Listen to me, she insisted, her hand weakly grasping his. If I don't make it, I need you to promise me you'll take Lily to my cousin. Her name is Margaret Thornton. Pine Ridge. Ethan swallowed hard. You're going to take her yourself? This fever will break soon. Promise me, Grace repeated, her eyes intense despite the fever. Unable to deny her, Ethan nodded. I promise, but it won't come to that. Grace seemed satisfied with his answer, her eyes drifting closed again. Ethan remained beside her, replacing the cool cloth on her forehead throughout the night. He spoke to her in the darkness, telling her about his life, things he'd never shared with anyone. How he'd come west after the war, trying to outrun memories of Gettysburg. How he'd worked as a cowhand, then foreman, before deciding the solitary life suited him better. How the mountains and plains had healed something broken inside him. You need to fight, Grace, he told her as the night deepened. Lily needs you. And I. He paused, surprising himself with what he'd been about to say. I need you to get better too. The blizzard lasted 3 days, during which Grace's fever finally broke. Ethan had nearly collapsed from exhaustion by then, having barely slept while caring for both mother and child. When Grace finally sat up and asked for water in a clear voice, Ethan felt a relief so profound it left him lightheaded. You had me worried, he admitted, helping her drink. How long was I sick? She asked, looking around the cabin with new awareness. Almost a week, he told her. The snow's been falling for 3 days straight. And Lily? She's perfect, Ethan assured her, glancing at the baby who was contentedly playing with a wooden spoon on a blanket near the fire. Smart as a whip, that one. Already trying to crawl. Grace's eyes filled with tears. You took care of her all this time? Ethan shrugged, suddenly self-conscious. It wasn't so hard. We came to an understanding, her and I. The way Grace looked at him then made something shift in Ethan's chest, a sensation both uncomfortable and exhilarating. He busied himself preparing food, avoiding her gaze. As February turned to March, the snow began to melt, revealing patches of brown earth beneath. Grace regained her strength, and Ethan found himself inventing reasons to delay their departure for Pine Ridge. The truth, which he was reluctant to admit even to himself, was that he'd grown accustomed to their presence. The cabin no longer felt empty and cold, but alive with Lily's giggles and Grace's soft singing. One evening, as they sat before the fire after Lily had been put to bed, Grace asked the question Ethan had been dreading. When do you think we can travel to Pine Ridge? Ethan stared into his coffee cup. The trail should be clear enough in another week or 2. But there's no rush. You're both welcome here as long as you need. Grace was quiet for a long moment. We've imposed on you for too long already. You must be eager to return to your solitude. No, Ethan said, more sharply than he'd intended. He softened his tone. It's been nice having you both here. It has been nice, Grace agreed, her eyes meeting his. Lily adores you. The feeling is mutual, Ethan admitted with a small smile. She's a special little girl. Grace hesitated, then asked, have you ever thought about having a family of your own, Ethan? The question caught him off guard. I did once. A long time ago. He set down his cup. There was a girl back in Pennsylvania, before the war. We had plans. But after Gettysburg, I wasn't the same man. She married someone else while I was still recovering from my wounds. I'm sorry, Grace said softly. Ethan shrugged. It was for the best. She got the life she deserved, a whole man, not someone haunted by things he'd seen and done. You seem whole to me, Grace observed. The way you care for Lily, the way you saved us both. Those aren't the actions of a broken man. Her words warmed something inside him that had been cold for a very long time. They sat in comfortable silence after that, watching the flames dance in the fireplace. As March progressed, Ethan found more reasons to delay their journey. There were spring storms to wait out, reports of muddy trails that would make travel difficult, a suspicious cough of Lily's that required monitoring. Grace didn't press the issue, which gave Ethan hope that perhaps she wasn't in a hurry to leave either. They fell into domestic patterns that felt surprisingly natural. Grace took over the cooking and mending, while Ethan hunted and tended his small herd of cattle. In the evenings, they would sit together by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes in comfortable silence. Ethan found himself looking forward to these quiet moments more than anything else. Lily took her first proper crawl on a sunny April morning, making her way determinedly across the cabin floor toward Ethan's boots. Both adults cheered her accomplishment, and when Ethan scooped her up in celebration, spinning her around to her delighted giggles, he caught Grace watching them with an expression that made his heart skip. That night, after Lily was asleep, Grace joined Ethan outside where he sat on the porch steps, looking up at the stars. I should tell you something, she said, settling beside him. About my cousin in Pine Ridge. Ethan tensed, sensing this conversation would change things between them. The truth is, I'm not entirely sure she's still there, Grace admitted. We haven't exchanged letters in over a year. My husband, he didn't approve of her. Said she had loose morals because she never married. So you might not have anywhere to go, Ethan stated, trying to keep his voice neutral. Grace nodded. It was desperation that made me set out with Lily. I couldn't think beyond getting away from the bank men who took our farm. A silence stretched between them as Ethan processed this information. Finally, he turned to face her. Stay, he said simply. Both of you stay here. This place. It's big enough. I could build on another room. Lily would have space to grow up, with the mountains and the sky. Grace looked startled. Ethan, I couldn't impose. It's not an imposition, he interrupted. These past months have been the best I've had since. Well, since before the war. Having you both here. He struggled to find the right words. It feels right. As what? Grace asked quietly. Your housekeepers? Your charity cases? Ethan shook his head, frustrated with his inability to express what he felt. As family, he said finally. If you want. Grace's eyes widened. Are you asking? I'm not doing this right, Ethan muttered, running a hand through his hair. I never thought I'd do this again, so I'm out of practice. He took a deep breath. Grace Ellis, I think I've been falling in love with you since I pulled you from that river. You and Lily both. I know it hasn't been long, and I know you're still grieving your husband, but I'm asking if you might consider staying. Not as my housekeeper or out of charity, but as my wife. Someday, when you're ready. Grace was silent for so long that Ethan began to regret his impulsive declaration. Then he felt her hand slip into his. I thought it was just gratitude I was feeling, she said softly. For saving us, for caring for Lily when I was sick. But it's more than that. The way you look at her, like she's the most precious thing in the world. The way you never made us feel like burdens. She squeezed his hand. I'm not ready for marriage yet. You're right about that. But I'd like to stay, if you're sure. And I'd like to see where this feeling between us leads. Relief and joy flooded through Ethan. I'm sure, he assured her. We can take all the time you need. They sat together under the stars, hands entwined, making tentative plans for a future neither had imagined possible just months before. Spring blossomed into summer, and Ethan made good on his promise to expand the cabin. With help from a few former cowhands from the rocking tee, he added a proper bedroom for Grace and Lily, as well as a covered porch where they could sit in the evenings and watch the sunset over the mountains. Lily thrived in the mountain air, growing stronger and more curious by the day. She took her first steps holding on to Ethan's fingers, her face a picture of determination. By August, she was toddling around the cabin and yard, getting into everything, her delighted laughter a constant soundtrack to their days. Grace found a talent for gardening, coaxing vegetables and herbs from the rocky soil behind the cabin. She even planted flowers bright spots of color against the weathered wood of their home. Ethan watched her transformation from the frightened, desperate woman he'd pulled from the river to this confident, blooming person who hummed as she worked. They developed their own rituals and traditions. Sunday picnics by the creek when the weather was fine. Reading aloud in the evenings from the small collection of books Ethan owned. Grace teaching Lily her letters using sticks in the dirt. Ethan showing them both the constellations on clear nights, making up stories about the stars that made Lily clap her hands with delight. As summer began to wane, Ethan noticed Grace becoming quieter, more thoughtful. He worried she was reconsidering their arrangement, perhaps thinking of continuing on to Pine Ridge after all. One evening, after Lily was asleep, he found the courage to ask her what was troubling her. "Nothing's troubling me," she assured him, looking surprised at his concern. "I've just been thinking a lot lately. About the future." Ethan's stomach tightened, and Grace took his hand, leading him to sit beside her on the porch steps, the same place where he'd asked her to stay months earlier. "I've been thinking about what you asked me that night in April," she said softly. "About being your wife." Ethan held his breath, afraid to hope. "My husband was a good man," Grace continued. "He worked hard, and he provided for us. But we were companions more than anything else. It was a marriage of convenience, arranged by our parents." She looked down at their joined hands. "I've never known what it feels like to be in love. Not until now." She raised her eyes to his. "I'm ready, Ethan, if you still want me." For a moment, Ethan couldn't speak past the lump in his throat. Then he pulled her gently into his arms, resting his forehead against hers. "I've never wanted anything more in my life," he whispered. Their first kiss was tentative, sweet with the promise of all that lay ahead. When they parted, both were smiling, a little shy but certain. They were married 2 weeks later by a traveling preacher who stopped at their homestead on his circuit. It was a simple ceremony, with only Lily and a few neighbors as witnesses, but to Ethan, it was perfect. Grace wore a dress of pale blue calico, with wildflowers in her hair. Lily toddled between them during the vows, making everyone laugh. That night, after Lily was asleep in her new bed in the small room Ethan had built especially for her, husband and wife discovered each other with tender patience. Grace's initial shyness gave way to wonder as Ethan showed her that physical love could be beautiful and mutual. For Ethan, the experience was a revelation, healing wounds he hadn't realized were still raw. Life settled into new rhythms after their marriage. Ethan expanded his cattle herd, providing a steady income. Grace's garden flourished, allowing them to preserve food for the winter months. They made occasional trips to the nearest town for supplies, where Grace began selling her extra preserves and the intricate quilts she worked on during the long winter evenings. Their first Christmas as a family was a joyous affair. Ethan cut a small pine tree from the forest and brought it home strapped to his saddle. Grace decorated it with paper stars she'd cut and painted, strings of dried berries, and small wooden animals Ethan had carved for Lily. They exchanged simple gifts: a new hunting knife for Ethan, a beautiful shawl for Grace that Ethan had traded a calf for, and a cloth doll for Lily that Grace had secretly sewn at night. As they sat together by the fire that Christmas night, Lily sleeping contentedly in Ethan's lap, Grace took his hand and placed it gently on her stomach. "I have one more gift for you," she whispered, "but it won't arrive until summer." Ethan's eyes widened as he understood her meaning. "Truly," Grace nodded, her eyes shining. "A brother or sister for Lily." Joy unlike anything Ethan had ever known filled his chest. He gathered Grace into his free arm, holding his family close, marveling at how full his once empty life had become. Winter passed in a cocoon of warmth and anticipation. Ethan found himself watching Grace with wonder as her body changed, carrying their child. He took on more of the household chores as her pregnancy progressed, insisting she rest when she tried to do too much. Lily, now nearly 2, seemed to understand something special was happening. She would pat Grace's growing belly gently, saying, "Baby," in her sweet voice. Ethan taught her to help him with his chores, her little face serious as she handed him tools or carried small sticks for the fire. Spring came early that year, bringing with it new life everywhere they looked. Calves in the pasture, birds nesting in the eaves of their expanded cabin, wildflowers carpeting the meadows. Grace bloomed along with the season, her face glowing with health and happiness. In early June, after a short but intense labor with a midwife from a neighboring homestead attending, Grace gave birth to a son. Ethan, who had paced outside until the midwife finally called him in, fell instantly in love with the tiny red-faced boy Grace placed in his arms. "He looks like you," Grace said tiredly, watching them with a smile. "What shall we name him?" Ethan studied his son's face, overwhelmed by the responsibility and privilege of naming this new life. "What about Samuel?" "After my father. Samuel Zimmerman." Grace tested the name. "It's perfect." Lily was fascinated by her baby brother, wanting to help with every aspect of his care. Ethan marveled at how naturally she took to her role as big sister, singing the same lullabies to Samuel that Grace sang to her. That summer was the happiest of Ethan's life. His family was complete, his home filled with love and purpose. The nightmares of Gettysburg that had once plagued him came less and less frequently, replaced by dreams of his children growing up strong and free in the shadow of the mountains. In August, when Samuel was 2 months old, Ethan took Grace to a special spot he'd discovered years earlier, a high meadow overlooking the valley, carpeted with wildflowers and sheltered by tall pines. They brought a picnic and spread a blanket, watching Lily chase butterflies while Samuel slept peacefully in Grace's arms. "Do you ever think about that day on the river?" Ethan asked, lying back to look up at the cloud-scattered sky. "How close we came to never having all this." Grace shuddered slightly at the memory. "Sometimes. In my darkest moments, when I was at my most desperate, I never could have imagined ending up here." She looked around the beautiful meadow, then at her children, and finally at Ethan. "It feels like a miracle." "It is a miracle," Ethan agreed, reaching out to touch Samuel's tiny hand. "Every day with you all is a miracle." Grace leaned over to kiss him softly. "Thank you for pulling us out of the ice that day, for saving us." Ethan smiled against her lips. "Thank you for staying, for giving me a reason to come in from the cold." As the afternoon sun warmed the meadow, the Zimmerman family remained together on their blanket, secure in the knowledge that the love that had begun in the most desperate of circumstances had grown into something enduring and beautiful, a legacy that would sustain them through whatever challenges lay ahead. Years passed, and their family continued to grow and thrive. Lily became a confident young woman with her mother's strength and her adoptive father's quiet determination. Samuel grew into a thoughtful boy who loved the land as much as Ethan did. They were joined by a sister, Emma, born 3 years after Samuel, who inherited Grace's talent for growing things. The small cabin expanded into a proper ranch house as their fortunes improved. Ethan's cattle operation became one of the most respected in the territory, known for the quality of its stock. Grace's garden expanded into a small but profitable business, supplying vegetables and preserves to the growing town 20 miles away. Through it all, Ethan and Grace's love deepened and strengthened. They faced hardships, drought years, harsh winters, the normal challenges of raising children on the frontier, but always together, their bond forged in ice and fire on that January day by the Powder River. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Ethan took Grace back to the spot where he'd first asked her to stay. The old porch steps had been replaced years ago when they expanded the house, but they still sat there sometimes in the evenings, watching the stars. "Do you remember what you told me that night?" Grace asked, leaning her head on his shoulder. "About falling in love with me since you pulled me from the river?" Ethan nodded, wrapping his arm around her. "Best decision I ever made, running toward that sound instead of away from it." "I've been thinking," Grace said, her voice thoughtful, "about how sometimes the worst moments of our lives can lead to the best. If I hadn't lost the farm, if I hadn't been desperate enough to try crossing that river with Lily, we might never have met." Ethan finished for her. "I know. I think about that too, sometimes." They sat in companionable silence, watching the last light fade from the sky, secure in the life they'd built together, a life that had begun with a desperate cry for help, a frozen river, and the courage of a cowboy who couldn't look away from someone in need.